This is Changemakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
This week's Changemaker is Bryan Greene, the Vice President of Policy Advocacy at the National Association of Realtors. With over a decade of experience at the forefront of fair housing policy, Bryan now leads legislative and regulatory efforts on behalf of the association's 1.5 million members. His distinguished career includes serving as the highest-ranking official in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, where he oversaw the enforcement of housing anti-discrimination laws. Bryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Katie. Good to be with you today.
It's great to have you join me, and I first met you over 10 years ago when you were speaking at a national leased housing conference on fair housing. Ironically enough, I still remember your topic, your passion, and what you covered, so I am really thrilled to have you here.
Gosh, an elephant's memory. Okay.
Let's talk about your journey. Why don't you take us back and go over what it was like when you first started getting into affordable housing, and maybe tell us how you have progressed through the Fair Housing Office, and then we'll cover where you are now.
So I've spent most of my life, about 2/3 of my life, working in the area of fair housing. So really focusing on making sure that housing of all types is available to all people without discrimination. And I actually came to housing mostly from a civil rights perspective. So when I was at college, I took a course with Julian Bond, the great civil rights activist, and one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he came to Harvard to teach a course that I took my senior year, I think it was, just about the civil rights movement. And this was a movement I was, familiar with, and everyone knew who, Dr. King was. And I knew there had been student protests too. But, I was 19, 20 and didn't know all the details. And it helped me appreciate just how recent it was. It also, helped me to just appreciate how segregation had shaped the country. And so I began my career actually working at the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination while I was a student, dealing with discrimination in housing, but also in employment and public accommodations, and then went over to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to investigate housing discrimination cases in the 6 New England states in the beginning, and then went to Washington, sort of invited to come down and join the team there, and then progressed through the ranks where I ended up spending the last decade or so at the top of the organization, overseeing all of our national work and all of our national programs for nonprofits and state and local agencies as well. So yeah, and then I left in 2019 to join the National Association of Realtors, where I was its first director of fair housing policy, and after about a year and change, and then progressed to be the vice president for all of our policy advocacy, dealing with the broad range of issues we address, like taxes and mortgage finance and insurance, also fair housing. But I bring to it, I think, that perspective of civil rights and justice, and ensuring that we're bringing everyone forward in all of our housing policy.
Were there other pivotal experiences that influenced your decision to move through FHEO, or even going from Harvard University and into this type of a career, other than the one you described? Were there other experiences?
I think there were foundational experiences. I grew up in New York City, and New York City is highly segregated. And I grew up in Queens, where you can actually see the demarcation line between Black neighborhoods and the northern white neighborhoods, which have some integration with Asian Americans, but very few African Americans in those communities. But you see a bright line that cuts across Queens and actually into Brooklyn, where African Americans live in the southern parts of those boroughs, which of course made them easy targets for predatory lending later. So Queens, for example, has very stable African American middle class neighborhoods all throughout southern Queens. It's single family residential housing that African Americans were able to purchase in the 40s, 50s, 60s. They were allowed to purchase there. And because they were stable middle class neighborhoods, they were targeted for predatory lending. And so I always recognized growing up this unusual division. And we were bused to school from this middle class African American neighborhood to the middle class white neighborhoods that had received more school funding, and always just confused me as to why this existed. And so I think when I took that course with Julian Bond, it provided me with some insight as to, how America, why America is organized this way. And I've written actually some on this as well, specifically on my experiences in Queens and just how all the great jazz musicians and other Black luminaries moved into this area because it was the only place in New York they were permitted to buy, single family house with a yard and driveway, really beautiful, you call it, place to grow up. But it was only when whites lost cases involving racially restrictive covenants that they were able to move into those areas. And then there was the white flight. And so in some ways, what I experienced in Queens was the fair housing story in microcosm. And that just, I think, has reinforced my commitment to fair housing. And as I've pursued my career, it's really been with that in mind. Like, how do we overcome these boundaries, specifically with a recognition that, the people in my community should have been able to purchase anywhere, and how purchasing and being limited to purchasing in African American communities where there's disinvestment and where there's appraisal bias and all manner of things, we've created a tale of two cities throughout the country.
These are concepts that many people are just now becoming aware of, or they've been aware but have not been able to exercise improvements or policy changes. And it's a process that has been stalled and expedited. What I like in the role that you've really been the voice for fair housing for so many years, and not just serving as the highest ranking career official in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, but you really were able to bring a lot of awareness and policy changes on this. But start real basic, and for our listeners who are coming from all different perspectives, start from that point and tell us, what is the impact of discrimination on the housing market? You mentioned lending, you mentioned, other types of access to, different tools, but we'll start real basic for us, and let's increase our awareness on some of those concepts related to the housing market and that impact of discrimination.
So in its most basic sense, you're denying people of their choice, right? And so you see a house you want that you are qualified to purchase, or, in the case of rental, that you're qualified to rent. It may be the place you want because it's close to the school you want to send your children, or it's close to your job. And so to be denied that, really for any basis, but, I think in many ways it's much more pernicious based on race, and it's, much more manifest in terms of, our neighborhood patterns based on race. But, so it denies you first the thing that you're entitled to. And then beyond that, there are cascading harms that it causes. So then not being able to live where you want to, maybe now you have increased transportation costs to get to that place. Let's say if you're trying to buy in a suburban community and you face housing discrimination and you have to commute farther to that office park or something. But then, obviously not being able to send your children to the schools that you want to, that causes harms, not just even to the head of household, but to the entire family. And then, as I mentioned before, there are still great differences in the appraisals of different communities. And it can be for a host of reasons, and some that aren't necessarily discriminatory, but nevertheless, if there's lower demand to live in certain communities, it can affect just how much equity people have in their homes, right? People invest in homes with the expectation that they'll appreciate. And so if you see those differences in appreciation, that can be significant for, the family finances, which in turn is what people often rely on to be able to send their children to school or to have money for other needs. And social networks as well. It's noteworthy that in the United States, in the same city, you may have different accents among Americans who've lived in this country whose families have lived in this country for centuries. And that is often based on just how absolutely rigid the segregation is in many of these communities. All of these things, the social and the economic, affect folks. And we see that in data. We see it, when we're looking at home ownership data and how well placed people are to purchase homes in the present day, either because they are first generation home buyers with less equity in order to afford the down payment or the opportunities to purchase, or because of, the lack of equity in the homes that their family did purchase, that they don't have the wealth that other families have, when they sell their homes and can use that equity to purchase the new home. And so you see a lot more African Americans who have to go into great debt to go to school, to go to college. They have to get more advanced degrees in order to afford the home because they don't have family resources to draw on. Many are tapping into their retirements and pensions to get homes. So they're borrowing against, what should be a nest egg for the future that others don't. So there are all those ripple effects, not to mention also the social effects of just being sort of dislocated from the mainstream.
So, what additional steps do you think are necessary to further the progress of fair housing and really create more inclusive communities?
This might be a different answer than you're expecting. I mean, first, I think most people have to be better educated about how we got here. In order for people to support legislation, regulations, they have to believe in it. And, whether you're looking at, comments on news stories or just public debate, it's clear a lot of people just don't understand the different circumstances that many Americans find themselves in, or just even the history, that led to where we are. And so, that's, I think, one of the reasons why there's, such a tortured debate on student loan debt. A lot of people somehow recognize, I think, that African Americans, especially, are more reliant on student loans and owe a lot more, but they don't entirely appreciate why they're poor. They think that this is just, long-standing effect from events 160 years ago, but don't appreciate how housing policy is probably the most proximate cause for the differences in wealth. The fact that whites on average have about 6 to 8 times the wealth of African American families. Some people just think, oh, well, it's taking a while for them to catch up. Like, no. It's really more directly the result of actions that we've taken in the past 70 years or so. And we could talk more about those things like redlining and denial of access to the GI Bill. Those are probably the most recent reasons or the accelerants of this disparity. And those things happened within the lifetimes, if not of people listening here, certainly their parents. And so I would say for all the people listening here, it has affected where they are today quite immediately. So, what my parents were able to achieve and your parents were able to achieve is almost directly the result of housing policy from the that lasted until the late 60s, at least legally. So all that said, if you don't understand that, you're voting based on ignorance for when it comes to housing policy or other legislation that would try to rectify some of these disparities. So that is the most fundamental answer I have for that. In terms of what actually should be done, let me just say that while we certainly need to enforce our laws against housing discrimination, they're not alone going to make up for the history of exclusion and what it has wrought. And so we really do have to look at what kind of actions would sort of help restore these differences. So I think some of the things we need to do that could make a big difference that many people can get behind is increase housing supply in this country, because one thing that the housing shortage is doing is exacerbating existing disparities, meaning that only those who have financial advantage, and I've described how those disparities came about. The folks with the greatest financial advantage can take advantage of this market, and those who don't have resources are falling behind. And so if you look at the racial home ownership gaps in the country, they're just going to get greater, even if you address discrimination, just because people can't equally compete. There's no level playing field, and it's disproportionately racial, the difference. So building out housing supply helps create more affordability. So we have to at least do that so people have a shot at being able to afford something. And then, these other things like down payment assistance, sure, that helps, but it's only going to help, in a market that's not crazy. And then I think that the nation needs to figure out how it wants to address student loan debt issues. We certainly need to make sure we have a mortgage credit system that is fair. Now, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are recognizing that people should get some credit for responsibly paying rent and utilities on time each month. So their biggest housing purchase, or their biggest purchase, which is their housing, they should get credit for. That there shouldn't just be homeowners who are paying on a loan who get credit for that, or it shouldn't be limited to your credit card timely payments. So all of that helps, but I think the biggest game changer is actually if we were to mount like a Marshall Plan to build close to 7 million units short.
Those are excellent strategies and approaches. And I want to pick up on something that you had mentioned you written on, the poverty and race, and you even contributed to the Smithsonian and Washington Post on some of these articles. Was that part of an extension of your role and what you were seeing and what was needed? Or just tell us the context of how you got involved in contributing and writing it on this.
I did that in my spare time, just as Bryan Greene, not as part of my job when I was at HUD or as my job at the National Association of Realtors. I enjoy writing. I take a great interest in history, and looked for outlets where I could contribute more to the public conversation on these things. And so I wrote a couple of articles for a publication called Poverty and Race. One was about my hometown, St. Albans, Queens, and just the story that St. Albans tells that speaks to the larger fair housing issues in this country. I was pleased actually that sometime later, National Geographic wrote a story also about St. Albans, where they called me and quoted me in that story. But I think there's a recognition that it's in many ways, just a model to tell the story of Black wealth and the vicissitudes of fortune for Black people because of different policies and attitudes in this country. And then I also wrote a piece for Poverty and Race that it was a story about the 60s and civil rights and music that became the basis for the film Summer of Soul, which won an Academy Award a couple of years ago. And so I became a consulting producer on that film because the film largely tracks the story that I told in that 2017 piece. And then, yes, with Smithsonian, likewise, there were stories I wanted to tell. And, my first story, the Smithsonian, kind of came out of the work I was doing on Summer of Soul about African Americans and the moon landing, and how at that time we were making these great investments in looking at what was up there while there were great needs down here. And many people don't recall or know that there was that debate at the time. And so then, there's a wide range of subjects that I enjoy writing on. There's sort of deeper historical pieces I wrote. And I think I've probably written 10 or more stories for Smithsonian Magazine. And I've also written for the Washington Post on other historical events. So it's just something I enjoy.
That's an amazing legacy imprint, and really is a good intersection of your passions, your knowledge, and your professional background. Your family must be very proud of you.
In many ways, I mean, my immediate family is like, okay, can we pry him away from his computer? But I try to do it late at night.
Okay, Bryan, I want to move over to your current role, but we have to take a break. Coming up next time, Bryan Greene, the Vice President of Policy Advocacy at the National Association of Realtors, will discuss his organization's mission to close the home ownership gap.
One of our top legislative priorities to do more to promote federal policy that would create more housing. We see that as key to at least stabilizing things in this country, but it also ultimately is going to create more affordability too, which could help narrow that gap.
Thanks for listening to Changemakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.